estimated 500 million people infected, between 50 and 100 million dead. A world torn apart by war and by a strange, deadly new disease. It swept across the world, leaving nowhere untouched. It was so deadly, rumors spread through the streets that the Black Death had returned. This was the Spanish flu of 1918, the deadliest pandemic of the 20th century. Epidemics have infected societies throughout history. Usually epidemics come and go, but some truly stand out for their viciousness. In recent history, there has been no pandemic more devastating than the flu of 1918. Sometimes called the Spanish flu or swine flu, it killed about 675,000 in the United States alone. The outbreak came in the midst of World War I, and the flu would actually kill more troops than combat. The flu of 1918 was so deadly it killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Yet Spanish flu was horrifying for even more reasons. It was very contagious, and it killed extremely quickly, sometimes in as few as 12 hours. It killed people in the prime of their lives, with the most victims being young, healthy people aged 20 to 40. Additionally, it killed some of its victims in bizarre, brutal ways, completely unlike a typical flu virus. Some symptoms actually closely resemble the plagues, which killed millions in the Middle Ages. But scientists have analyzed the pathogen's genome and verified it was not Black Death, which killed millions in 1918. It was just the flu. This video will cover how the flu began and how it spread across the world, the bizarre symptoms that made it so deadly, and how the flu pushed society to the very brink of collapse. If the epidemic continues its mathematical rate of acceleration, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a few weeks. Victor Vaughan, Surgeon General of the Army, October 1918. No one can be absolutely sure where the pandemic originated, but there are several theories. In northern France, there was an outbreak of a flu-like disease at a British military base in 1917. The base was located in a swampy area with lots of waterfowl and pigs. New flu epidemics often arise when people have close contact with sick birds or pigs. There was a separate outbreak of respiratory disease among soldiers from Southeast Asia who fought in World War I from 1916 to 1918. Most flus start in Southeast Asia, and some historians argue the soldier may have brought a new virus to Europe. But historian John Barry makes the case in his fascinating book, The Great Influenza, that the flu may have originated on a farm in rural Kansas by jumping from infected pigs to humans. Indeed, the first officially recognized cases of the Spanish flu emerged at a military base in Kansas. The U.S. had just entered World War I, and training and industry had ramped up at a rapid pace as the war machine fired up. But in rural Haskell County, Kansas, a war of another type was quietly beginning. Haskell County was in the grip of a deadly outbreak of what seemed to be a mysterious new disease. People in the community, farmers mostly, may have caught the new disease when a pathogen from sick pigs jumped species and began infecting humans. The new virus, the swine flu, was shockingly contagious and extremely deadly. A local doctor was terrified by the death toll of the new virus and contacted the U.S. Public Health Service for advice. His concern was noted, but nothing else was done. After all, it was a tiny rural backwater. How could it spread far in such a sparsely populated area? Slowly the virus began to die down as it ran out of new people to infect. Perhaps it would have stopped there had the times been different, but 1918 was the perfect breeding ground for a worldwide pandemic. In early 1918, every military base was teeming with young men training for war. The military hurried to build new barracks, hospitals, training areas, and facilities to support the influx of hundreds of thousands of men. Some of these men were volunteers, and some had been drafted. The strange new disease was just dying down in Haskell County when a few young men left there, headed to Camp Funston, Kansas, for training. Camp Funston, located at modern-day Fort Riley, was already over capacity, with 56,000 young men training for war. There hadn't been time to build enough barracks for all of them. It was the coldest winter on record east of the Rockies, yet many men were sleeping in tents without any heat and only thin blankets. In an effort to keep them all warm, The commander ordered all the men to move into barracks, violating the health and safety rules that dictated how much space each soldier should have. Inside the barracks, men huddled around stoves trying to keep warm. The men from Haskell County must have crowded in close too, even as they began to cough and sneeze. That's all it took. In the overcrowded barracks, the flu spread rapidly. It only took 6 days for the outbreak to begin. The men from Haskell County arrived on February 28th. Less than 1 week later, men began flooding into sick call. Within just a few weeks, the flu swept across the base, sickening thousands and killing between 38 and 50. It was a high death rate for the flu, but it was nothing compared to what was coming next. The virus was about to mutate and become much, much worse. Flu viruses are constantly mutating, and sometimes there will be a really big shift, or a virus that usually affects only animals mutates so it can infect people too. When that happens, it can be very deadly. The flu comes in waves. That's why we have a flu season. Although it may seem like a bad flu is done, the flu can hide for a while, or go infect people in a different part of the world and then return even worse. In the case of the 1918 flu, 3 waves of flu devastated the world. The first wave wasn't too bad, but the second and third waves were extremely dangerous. The outbreak at Camp Funston came just at the end of the flu season in the United States, so the first wave infected a lot of people, but then faded away. The military wasn't worried. They were grappling with a far more deadly outbreak of measles at the time. The flu virus seemed to fade away, but really it just went abroad to take on a world at war. It stalked into camp when the day was damp and chilly and cold, with a hand that was clammy and bony and bold, and its breath was icy and moldy and dank, and it killed so speedy and gloatingly greedy that it took away men from each company rank. The flu, Private Josh Lee, 1919. Nearly all the ships carrying American troops to war arrived at the port in Brest, France. In April of 1918, just as the flu outbreak was dying down at Camp Funston, an epidemic began in Brest and slowly began spreading throughout northern France. Despite the illness spreading in the city, more and more troops poured in. Healthy men would land, become infected, and then ship out to new duty stations and to the front line, carrying the disease through every small town and hamlet through which the armies traveled. The flu tore across France and followed the front lines into Belgium and the Netherlands. It jumped across the lines of war and began infecting the German army, actually affecting the outcomes of battle since so many troops were too sick to fight. It jumped from the German army to the German people. By May, it had reached Italy, where it crossed the Mediterranean and surged into North Africa. It also arrived in England by May, riding back on boats with troops heading home. Infection and death rates began to skyrocket in Spain and Portugal. The flu gained its name, the Spanish flu, from the early infection and high mortality rate in Spain, where reported 8 million died in May. Spain was neutral in World War I, and as a result, it was one of the only countries that was reporting the news without strict government censorship. Most countries didn't want to reveal to their enemies that they were battling an epidemic, and didn't want to affect their people's morale, so the governments pressured the media to hide and downplay the severity of the virus. However, in neutral Spain, the press was free to report the news accurately. Newspaper headlines in Spain screamed of an epidemic that was killing millions, while other countries only whispered of the flu. The world believed the flu was worse than Spain, when in actuality, Spain was the only one talking about it at first. The flu continued spreading beyond Western Europe. By July, it had jumped to Scandinavia and Greece. The same month, the flu crept its way into a tense Russia, where the Tsar and his family had just been executed, and the Bolsheviks were battling with other factions to see who would control the future of Russia. A boat filled with 6 sailors arrived in Mumbai, India at the end of May. First, a few dock workers reported sick. Then workers at the next docks became ill. And then men at the nearby warehouses got sick, and so on, into the city. Ships left those same infested docks and spread to other ports in Asia. Sick people boarded trains in Mumbai and spread the disease like wildfire along the railroad lines up into the subcontinent and continental Asia. The flu showed up in China around the same time, spreading inland from a dock in Shanghai. By June, it had arrived in Singapore, a world trade hub where the flu infected the dock workers and spread to the local population. From the bustling docks, sailors carried the flu south into Indonesia and north into Malaysia and Thailand, where it continued to spread. By July, it had reached sub-Saharan Africa, with infected